Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our live session today. I'm Jena McGregor, the managing editor of Charter. Charter is a future of work media, events, and research company that focuses on bridging research to practice. Excuse me, to help leaders tackle some of the biggest challenges they have today, from transforming their organizations as AI reshapes the world of work to leading workplaces that develop employees in a time of so much change and anxiety about the world. Today, leaders face extraordinary demands on their time and escalating pressures to use AI to keep up, not only with where their business is headed, but with what their employees expect. Even as markets shake, jobs feel less secure, and the future of work changes faster than ever, the appetite for listening to employees is not slowing down. If anything, it's accelerating. But as listening expands, so does the pressure to prove its impact and its value. In today's conversation, we'll talk with two leaders in this space, explore new data about employee listening, and examine how leading organizations are turning insight into measurable business value. I'm so excited to introduce our two panelists. Laura Fuentes is the Chief Human Resources Officer and Head of Supply Chain Management at Hilton, the hospitality company that I know so many people here know so well, a perennial top-ranked company on lists of the best places to work. Hilton currently has more than 500,000 team members working at more than 9,100 properties in 143 countries and territories around the world. Wow. The company reports that it has more than 93% employee engagement rate, which is such an impressive figure. I'm looking forward to talking to you about that, Laura. Um, Laura became CHRO in 2020 and worked at both Capital One and McKinsey before that. Brad Wilson is the global head of research and insights with Perceptyx, where he partners with internal and external stakeholders to research critical global trends and oversee the millions of survey responses from Perceptyx's clients. He has partnered with leaders from over 300 companies and brands to lead complex listening programs. So, a couple of last minute housekeeping items from me before we get started. We hope our conversation today shapes clear takeaways, insights, and ideas that you can put to work in your own organizations. We have a couple of places where you can suggest questions for our panelists, which we will get to throughout the conversation today, either in the chat or in the Q&A. You can drop them in, and I'll share those with our panelists. I want to also just mention our new Employer Brand Summit, which is coming up June 9th in New York. I'll drop a link to it in the chat. Anyone can register to attend virtually for free and apply to attend in person. So we're really excited about discussing many of the issues that I know that will be really important here today as part of that day in June. Laura, I want to start with you as we kick things off. When most of us think about employee listening at this kind of scale, 500,000 employees, we think about surveys, data, excuse me, dashboards. You've described what you're trying to build at Hilton as a fully human experience at work. We face a world today where people feel far less certain about their workplaces, their jobs, the future of employment. Tell me how you think about employee listening in that context, how it fits into what people are really facing today.
Yeah, great place to start. And thank you so much for having me here, Jenna. It's really a joy to be here with you and Brad and look forward to the conversation. So look, we've been around, you shared some of our stats. We have over 500,000 team members around the world. We operate in over 120 countries and territories, and we've been around for over 100 years as a company. We've been a listening company for that entire time, but I will say the human experience at work, we actually really started talking about that during COVID. And the reason was that there was so much uncertainty, not dissimilar from what people are facing today in the world. And folks at that time were having some of this soul searching about work, right? It was, the time of the Great Resignation. People were feeling really uncertain about all sorts of things. Their mental wellness, their physical wellness, the state of the world, safety, travel. And what we realized in that moment too is that people did not want to be, sold a work experience, an employee experience. They wanted to be seen as humans. And so we thought to ourselves, okay, like what if we had the most human experience at work? And that really starts with people feeling seen, heard, listened to, taken care of, developed, challenged, and then ultimately connected to something larger than themselves. And that became the basis of our refreshed team member value proposition. And I'll say a couple of things here. For us at Hilton, employee listening, team member listening, it's three core components to that. It's the intentional, deliberate, sustained act of understanding the team member experience. That's number one. Number two, driving action from that understanding, right? So it's not just listening, but actually driving some action. That's the second sort of component of listening. And the third component is the action needs to drive positive performance, outcomes for our business, for our team members, right? So it's, do we understand? Do we do something about it? Is what we're doing, moving us in the right direction. And that's really how we think of the ecosystem of listening. And for us, of course, it has to be an always on. It has to be for all. We're global, we're complicated. We've got multiple brands under our umbrella. And so we want to make sure that all of our team members, not just some, feel heard. And we know that it is deeply connected, our employee listening and experience, to our guests. Because our fundamental belief is when our team members feel listened to, heard, supported, that's how they're going to make our guests feel. So we have like a really integrated point of view on how this drives our business. And then we can get into, how we do it, which is obviously, balancing the macro and the micro and really building sustainable systems. But that's sort of the broader philosophy that we think about when we come.
I'd love to come back to that how in a second. And I love that you connected that issue of the listening and then the action, because I know that's a big part of what Brad has found in the research that they've done, and just the importance of making that link and the gap between it that often exists. Brad, I thought I'd start with you. You've recently or are about to release your 5th annual State of the Employee Listening Report. And it really shows the field at a real inflection point, a lot of change happening. I know this year's research shows a big shift in what HR leaders say they're trying to solve for. I thought this was really interesting that employee performance and productivity is now the top talent priority at 37%, up from 23% just 2 years ago. Whereas things like psychological safety and hybrid work and transformation have pulled back. Tell us a little bit more about that big shift you saw in what are priorities and, what that tells us about the current moment.
Yeah, so one of the other observations that I think is pertinent here is we saw a significant increase in when we asked about what are the biggest barriers to effectively listening within organizations. HR resources has been a challenge, and it continues to be among the top. About 25% of organizations said that's their top barrier. Where we saw the biggest increase, though, from last year to this year was a 65% increase in people citing budgetary constraints as their top barrier. And so what we're really seeing is organizations, and this isn't probably a surprise to anybody on the phone, but they're working in significantly resource constrained environments, and organizations seem to be going in one of two directions. So they're under pressure. We saw a significant increase in organizations becoming less mature in their listening. So it's more episodic, not necessarily tied to the business. It's kind of your traditional, we ask the same questions every year, and it's, they're slow to get results out. But we also saw an increase in organizations becoming more mature. So we're really kind of, they're choosing one of two paths. And those are organizations that are doing really what Laura described here, which is she kind of hit all of the main points. Is it's tied to the business and it's being used as a tool to create an edge rather than just trying to defend or become defensive and kind of check the box and do the bare minimum. They're understanding that employee voice, when we create an environment where people, again, seen, valued, heard, they have a sense of autonomy and agency, that unlocks value for the organization. And so thankfully, we're also seeing an increase in organizations moving in that direction. And really, it is interesting now, I think, again, with the resource constrained environment, there is an expectation that, every function justify their existence and their spend and every item, every line item in the budget. And so, understanding that when this is done well, it is a significant strategic tool to increase productivity and create an environment where, it's not an either or. It's not psychological safety or productivity. It's, productivity through that human employee team member experience.
I Laura checked all the boxes. We're done, right?
I'm
Yeah,
like nodding my head vigorously at everything he's saying. Yes.
yeah. I hear you say repeatedly this concept of like a resource strained and environment. I'd love to hear, Laura, you respond to that and just this idea of how do you defend and kind of make sure everyone sees the value of of doing employee listening programs, of making sure that the investment is there, that you're able to really keep that at the forefront and use it as a tool. Are you seeing any kind of pressures like that? And how have you found maybe in past times that you've figured out how to defend the use of it and make sure it stays strong?
Yeah, I mean, I will say, like, I've never had to defend the use of this because
Yeah,
it's so
great.
integrated into how we do everything, right?
Right.
And I think Brad's point was really essential here. This isn't just a defensive, employee listening. If you interpret employee listening as the complaint box and the suggestion box, like the complaint box alone, you're thinking about it the wrong way, right?
Yep.
I like to think of creating an environment that's a safe and strong place. So a place of safety where, yes, you can voice, the things that aren't working well and your leaders are listening and will act upon them, but also a place of strength where your ideas for innovation, for, our next brand, for how we could service our guests better are also listened to and taken care of. So it's this, of course, defensive, but more importantly, the strategic offensive
Mhm.
mechanism, because we always view that our team members are the ones on the front line. They see better than anyone else, like how we get in the way of a delightful guest experience, what we could be doing better. They're innovating on the ground every single day. So we want to capture that and scale it.
Mhm.
So my message would be, to folks, if you are, putting in an investment for the first time, to really think about, there are like financial scorecard metrics that you can show from an engagement, a turnover perspective, and innovation, retention, all those things that directly correlate to your bottom line if you need to justify a first time financial investment. I will say for us too, it's a little bit, we have macro and micro mechanisms for listening. So on the macro, all the things you would suspect, right? With the population of our scale, we've got our global team member survey. We partner very closely with the Great Place to Work Institute to have both an internal and external survey. We have our team member resource groups, which bring people together, our town halls, our skip levels. So we do that at an institutional level and interpret that feedback. At the micro level, we're always telling our leaders to be very intentional, to listen twice as much as you speak, to make sure that you're capturing every opportunity. It could be a one-on-one. It could be not only with our team members, with our guests, with our owners, right? To be able to detect, especially in this day and age, as you mentioned, Jenna, what are the signals through all the noise? And that's where like really being able to lift up, understand the patterns, find the moments that will drive the leverage, and create an environment where you're constantly sort of scanning for the insight as a leader. And that comes with a little bit of intentionality and practice and reminders. But to me, it is both that defensive and proactive. Some of our best ideas as far as guest and customer service come from the moments that you almost dismissed with a guest, with a team member. Our best innovations in HR, and I'm happy to share some examples. But yeah, those are some of my early reactions. And I will say, like, the four pieces of this to us is like, you need to ask with purpose, right? So if you want to have this concept I've talked about, like being a chief listening officer, to do that well, like ask with purpose, interpret what you're getting, right? Like make sure that you actually take the time to process, especially at our scale, act, and then close the loop. And the storytelling around this is really important too, to create that culture that's based on a virtuous cycle of listening.
I love that you brought up that gap because I wanted to bring up the stats from Brad's research that speak to this. The data shows a persistent action gap, as you guys describe
Mhm.
it. 71% of employees say their organization shares survey results, but 59% say action plans get created, and only 51% say actual improvements resulted. Are you seeing that increase? Why do you think that gap is as large as it is? You know, tell us a little more about what the data tells
Yeah, so I
us.
think in a lot of ways, organizations well intended, and I managed an employee survey for a large nonprofit before I started at Perceptyx 15 years ago now. So it was a long time ago. But I remember talking to a colleague about a challenge that they were having on the job with their manager. And, I said, the survey's coming up next week. Like, this is a great opportunity to provide that feedback because I knew how seriously the executive team took that. I reported directly to the CEO. And he made this comment. He said, we do the survey every 6 months and nothing ever happens. And I felt like I got stabbed in the chest when he said that because I'm like, I know how much is done. At the time, I was being mentored by one of the co-founders of Perceptyx, and I brought it up with him. And he said, what are you doing to communicate back and close the loop for employees? And I said, well, here's all the stuff we do at the executive level. But he pointed out, he said, those are all behind closed doors in a boardroom. And he said, people will not naturally connect the dots between feedback they provide
Hmm.
and things that happen, improvements that happen, if you are not clearly communicating that. And I think that's still a critical challenge. I've seen organizations come a long way. The tools, the technology has evolved. We have personalized action plans that go to every manager. But unfortunately, there are still steps in the process where we lose people along the way. And whether we're actually losing them or whether it's a perception issue or probably a combination of both, now what we're seeing is some of these new AI products that are coming to market are helping connect feedback that's provided and just in time learning moments and things that bring about meaningful behavior change that's constantly reminding people of here's what we heard and here's why we're doing this thing. So it gives people that sense of agency and ownership that they're having an influence not only in their work experience but the organization more broadly. And for employees, even if they're neutral on whether or not their improvements were made, it has a significant negative impact in trust and leadership and their own engagement at work. And in some cases, I would even go as far as to say it may be worse to field a survey and not do anything with it than to not ask at all. Because when you ask your colleagues for their input, you're creating an emotional, a psychological contract that then you're violating that contract if it feels as though the feedback's not going anywhere. So, Laura, I liked your steps. We have a similar model: ask, listen, respond, involve, and solve. And, if people only ask, they don't really analyze, they don't really listen, they're missing the most important parts because, we should think of survey data as a conversation starter, not the end.
That is
I,
so
I
well said. If I could
Yeah, go
pile on to
ahead.
that for a second, just giving you the experience we had at Hilton, which is very similar to what you described, Brad, years ago, right? If I take us like 10 plus years ago, we had put in place a survey, had taken it through a few cycles internally. And we were also beginning our best place to work journey with the Great Place to Work Institute. And the first few years, we weren't ranking anywhere on their lists. We weren't even making the top 100. And they would tell us, hey, look, you're good, but not great. And so we really dissected this like 4-piece framework because we were listening and HR was doing the things. We would talk
Mhm.
about them with the executive committee. We approved the programs. We would launch them into the ether. But the disconnect in our case was twofold. One, managers and leaders, and again, at our scale, it's massive, right? They weren't always aware of the things that were available. Like they would have loved to support our team members with the enhanced parental leave or our team member travel program, but they just weren't always evangelizing those programs because we really hadn't invested the time in getting them up to speed first as influencers almost of the cultural, programs that we were putting in place. So we really doubled down on manager and leader storytelling, communication, like bringing them on site. And the other thing is, when we would circle back with a communication from anyone, myself, the CHRO at the time, to our CEO of a new program, we literally created a stamp that we would put on the message that said, fueled by your feedback. And we would start every message with like, based on your feedback, you told us X, Y, and Z. Here's what we've done with it. And very clearly connecting those programs and then asking them in the next survey, adapting to say, how did this land, right? Like really reinforcing every aspect of the virtuous cycle. And then I will say, that's all like the massive at scale survey results, big programs. Sometimes, right, you can be in a town hall, you're getting a lot of feedback, you can get a lot of energy. You're in a moment of crisis or uncertainty. People are telling you they're feeling uncertain, anxious, and you may not be able to tell them yet all the answers, right?
Hmm.
You may never be able to share and fully open up, the entire thinking of an executive committee. But so then also grounding back to first principles, so people still feel heard, right? Like, hey, there is uncertainty in this moment. Here's what we know for sure, right? Like, here's what we're committed to, what we can share right now, how we'll bring you along, what you can expect. I think leaders sometimes feel frozen with like, well, I can't reveal this confidential situation. There's still a lot that you can do to make people truly feel seen and heard, even in the face of uncertainty and angst. And still be actively listening, even when you're not necessarily sharing an end result with them at the time. And that's part of co-creating a culture of trust, right?
Yeah.
Which is, it's really a two-way dialogue. Like you say, there's never a finish line. It's very iterative for us.
I love that stamp, that visibility, that just sort of giving that feedback loop to say we actually did this. This came to fruition. Brad, are there other examples of ways you've seen that really work very well to reinforce and remind people of what is actually being pulled from the listening and the feedback and the survey tools?
Yeah, so I've heard similar and I love that example with the stamp. I've worked with some quick service restaurants where they have a physical sticker. So as they make improvements in their restaurants, they literally put a sticker to remind people, hey, we upgraded this hardware because we heard that this was a major frustration for you. And I think those visible reminders are great. And those are for big, broad improvements that organizations make, and that's fantastic. We've also seen a lot of success for organizations where they're able to provide even more personalized learning moments through things like nudges and these reminders. And at the bottom of each of the reminders, there's a little question that says, you can click the link. Why am I getting this suggestion? And it ties back to here are the organizational priorities that are informing this. Here, these may be some of your personal learning objectives that you've identified. And so that's informing some of this. Or it may say, hey, here's some feedback that was provided on the survey. And so we've identified this as an opportunity for improvement because it's highly associated with either productivity or engagement or some other outcome that the organization cares about. And so, and I also think, Laura's done a fantastic job talking about making the case to team members and to colleagues and to frontline to see the impact. Another thing that came out in the study that I think is important is for those organizations that have regressed, that are becoming less mature in the face of a more resource-constrained environment, their top barrier, along with budget, is a lack of leadership buy-in. And so I think that's another important topic. And this may not be a challenge for Hilton. It sounds like y'all are, in line and things are good. Another thing that is important to remember, though, and a kind of a mistake that I've seen organizations make is treating listening not just as, the complaint box, as Laura mentioned, but also just treating it as a scorecard where the expectation is that engagement only goes up or scores only improve.
Mhm.
Obviously, we love to see that, but engagement is an outcome of both internal and external factors. So I can't imagine, I did work with some hospitality organizations in 2020. That is an incredibly disruptive experience that hopefully none of us live through again. But it would be concerning if in that environment, in all of that uncertainty, engagement stays the same. How could you anticipate success at the same level in the face of that uncertainty? And so I think understanding what are the leaders' priorities, what are the metrics that they're tracking, what are the things that they're working towards, integrating that into listening and identifying the associations between colleague experience and business outcomes is a way that HR leaders can position themselves, not that we're trying to convince them to care about, something different like engagement or psychological safety or belonging, but we can position it to say this is a path And if you follow this path, you will be more successful on your own terms. And that's a big opportunity that I think those less mature organizations, are less likely to do. And that is a great starting point for them if they're starting their journey to say, what are the priorities that leaders have already identified? How can we integrate that in, and how can we show the association that this is actually something that will set them up for success rather than trying to, get them, because we all have limited time, attention,
Yeah,
resources. If we're trying to divert
absolutely.
away from the core business, that's going to be a losing proposition. So I think that integration, thinking how do we make the connections for frontline colleagues,
Mhm.
but also how do we make the connection for leaders, because that's really critical to sustain and expand this type of program.
Laura, I saw you nodding your head. I love the term that you referred to earlier about being a chief listening officer, and I'm assuming in some way you're thinking of HR leaders, but really it's everyone at the executive level. How do you bring the
Yeah.
rest, bring the rest of the, what are some ways you've learned to bring the rest of the executive suite on board to really think about this as critical as it is, and to be chief listening officers themselves?
Yeah, look, and I think again, when we think about that concept at Hilton, it isn't only related to team member experience; it's our entire ecosystem, right? When the day we stop listening to our guests is the day we become irrelevant, right, to our owners, to our shareholders. So we are constantly scanning, across regions, across brands, and to Brad's great point, right? Even though overall our macro scores are terrific, any given year, in any given moment, right, we need to really double click at the regional, at the brand, at the hotel level. And,
Mhm.
we've got a distribution here of leaders and GMs who, for a number of reasons, sometimes it's, leadership driven, sometimes it's macro driven. It could be, external or internal factors driving fluctuations there, even within populations. So we really like to double click. And that's why this interpretation as a second core step of listening with care and doing the double clicks and the connections, like by generation, like how does the listening differ by region, like with everything happening in the Middle East right now, are we listening to our team members and what they need and what matters and our guests? So for us, it is being able to at scale have our macro story, but then really be able to double click. And we've built this in a really integrated way into our rituals, if you say, cultural rituals and rhythms for the company. So our annual team member survey, we get hundreds of thousands of comments from around the world that we interpret there. And our leaders, both in corporate and our hotels, are very sort of attuned to the fact that this factors into, their performance reviews, into their action plans and objectives for the year. There's a lot always to celebrate, but our team members expect that to be a moment of, really global listening. We also, drive, like I said, sort of rhythms that are more local, team-based, town halls, ask me anything, skip levels. We have toolkits for all of our leaders to really establish that psychological safety, but also really the idea incubator that our team members bring to the table. And so we've created rhythms for both of those, right? Whether it's, a hackathon, an innovation summit, really helping our team members share, scale, and stimulate their ideas and best thinking. And then, I'd say a final step too, it's the storytelling, the closing the loop, and also the celebration, right? And being able to both elevate courageous feedback, whether it's, pattern based in a survey or an individual raising their hand and, telling us about an opportunity that we may have. And really as a company, therefore, celebrating whether it's our great place to work rankings. I mean, we go crazy
Yeah.
with that. It's a really fun moment of pride too. But being honest with ourselves about like, we're never satisfied. There's no finish line here. So yes, we may be number one, world's best workplace. However, the reason we're there is because we're always looking for the next thing to fix, to solve,
Yep.
and we're never gonna, rest on our laurels. And so our team members know that too. And it creates a really, I think, constructive, open, environment for dialogue and continuous improvement and continued relevance.
So Laura, you talked about a lot of ways to bring in a lot of ideas. Brad, you talked about AI earlier. I want to make sure we dig into that now, and I'll start with you, Brad. Like this AI can just surface insights faster and faster. There's this,
Yep.
speed to build things much faster. And how do you collect and curate and aggregate all these ideas that are coming in? Is there a risk that with AI we have, more insights than we can put to work? Like how are you seeing companies manage that? How's that showing up in the data?
Yeah, so I would say, I mean, we've had a robust listening platform as long as I've been at Perceptyx, and we've had the ability to use AI in various terms. Even common analytics that's been around for over a decade is, a form of AI. I think what's really interesting and unique about this point in time is what generative AI brings to the table in terms of the ability to synthesize and summarize information, where it's really becoming a very, very powerful tool for prioritization. And I spoke at a conference, maybe I think it was 2 or 3 years ago in New York, and a CHRO for one of our clients came up to me, introduced herself. I didn't work with them directly, but I knew they were a customer. And she said, our survey just closed last week. We're getting access to results. She said, when you get back, to the office, she said, could you reach out to our survey team and tell them to relax a little bit? And I'm like, what does that mean? And she said, basically, the survey team is really excited about the results. There's a lot of enthusiasm and momentum and energy around this. But she said everybody else in the organization has a lot of other priorities, and they don't necessarily understand that this isn't at the top of everybody's list.
Yeah.
And that was a really interesting piece of feedback that I had never heard before. But what it told me is, unfortunately, especially if you have a 30, 40 question survey, to a lot of managers and people in organizations, that can suddenly feel like a 30 or 40 item to-do list because nothing is perfect. And when you work with an organization that has high standards, you can feel like, oh, we need to go fix all of these things. And unfortunately, in that environment, many leaders and managers will anticipate failure. They disengage from the process because why even bother? And then it creates this self-fulfilling prophecy of nothing ever changes. And so whether it's built into the platform or if it's, an AI tool that you're using to summarize data and comments, I think using it to say, hey, what is the next right thing that we can do? What is the one thing that we could focus on to move the needle? When we have that clear of a message that ties back to other organizational priorities and initiatives, it helps people anticipate success. Then they engage in the process and it helps create that altruistic cycle that builds on itself over time of we heard you, we
Yeah.
did something. We didn't do everything, but we did something. And then you start that positive momentum. And so we're really seeing great, great progress in terms of AI being able to deliver more personalized insights that help people prioritize and understand here's the next right thing that I should do.
I like that reminder because people are, I think, experiencing a lot of change fatigue right now. And, the idea of using these tools to help prioritize what's most important, I think is especially essential when that change fatigue feels very
Yeah.
real. Laura, tell us a little bit about how Hilton is using AI to help with employee listening. I know it's been something in some way you've been doing for a long time, but what's new and how are you using it more recently?
No, like as Brad mentioned, right? I mean, we've been using text analytics for like decade to really understand the number of inputs we get. So I'd say it's really three pronged benefit, right? When I think of AI, one, helping us collect better data and cleaner data, interpreting it with more detail and more speed, and driving concise, succinct like action plans and allowing all of that to happen not only behind the scenes with the HR team producing all of this, but really in the hands of managers, GMs, leaders. So there's more agency and a more real-time effect of data interpretation from a leadership perspective. Because it's funny, the example that you shared, Brad, I mean, we close our survey and we like to have within 48 hours in the hands of our executive committee our core reports. And if I go back to like 3 years ago, then our team would probably spend like a good month producing PDF reports to distribute to every VP and above. If, we had to have cutoffs because the volume was just unsustainable, right? And for each hotel general manager to receive a report, but that would take another 2 months. So that disconnect, especially in today's day and age, when things are happening so quickly, to be like, oh yeah, you'll get your results then in 2 months, then you'll begin the action planning process with your HR partner. So really you're putting things in in the market, if you will, 6 months after the feedback was given.
Yeah.
And so AI is allowing us to be more precise, more customized, faster. And so you can get to the 2 or 3 things that will move the needle more quickly. One thing I'm very excited about too is building our, sort of survey response agents that will be able to have all of our historical survey data, right? We've been doing this for a decade plus, where we can put all of our great place to work data and we can truly understand, like, hey, for this leader, where did we see improvements? How do they respond in this moment? And almost for, you can imagine a world where every one of our leaders has a listening coach where you can have all of that information at their fingertips, really helping you understand, where did I move the needle? Where have I regressed? Like, what are the 2 things I should really focus on that are going to make a difference? What has worked at other companies? Like, that kind of world is a really empowering world for our leaders, for our general managers, and ultimately, for our guests, because again, we show up better when we're empowered, when we're fixing things in the moment. And then look, there's very practical applications. Like, we get over 100,000 comments in our survey, and they're not all in English, and so having AI very quickly, like, scan, collect insights, like, we suddenly are, multilingual and can, again, at the drop of an instant, have insights from around the world in really powerful ways. We can co-create some really interesting artifacts to go back to our team members in creative and fun ways. So I'm very excited by the potential here. I mean, we live in this world where people feel like, AI is going to be a replacement for humans. I'm like, in this domain, I think it really amplifies the core human skills of listening, acting, and empowering the people behind the business.
Yep.
There's a question in the chat I'm going to throw at you, Laura, and then there's another one for you, Brad, since we're talking about AI. How are you incorporating employees' voices into the decisions you're making about AI? Are you using voice and listening tools to help the organization make decisions about how AI is used, or which tools you might put into play? I wonder if you could address that.
Yeah, well, for starters, we have AI questions in our survey. So we wanted to have a baseline. So we started a few months ago in our Great Place to Work surveys, asking very cleanly, like, do you feel like you have the right tools? Like, do you have a clear sense of where we're going with AI? And the results were, like, not our highest scoring results by a long shot, because frankly, we were still in learning mode. So I'm not surprised. And it was good to see, like, what's the baseline, and how does it vary by pocket? So we are asking at scale. We have, formed a couple of employee-based councils to help drive, early stages governance around the usage cases, the pilots that we have. Many of the tools that we're rolling out, we're doing so on a pilot mechanism, like large scale, right? We've got like 600 people on a ChatGPT pilot. And so we're bringing them together to really understand what worked, what didn't, how can we improve? And then within each of our teams, we're creating listening forums. Just as early as this week, across my teams, HR and supply chain, we had an AI innovation summit, really listening to our top users. What have you used this for? How can we improve it? How do we connect the dots? What didn't work? So we're getting feedback at every stage of the way, both at scale, power users, early users. We've just rolled out a training mechanism, and our team members sort of, this is the value too of building a listening culture. That then no matter what hits, there are all the mechanisms already in place. So yeah, it's AI, but it also could be, a new competitive brand. It could be, a macro geopolitical issue. Our team members know where to find us because all the mechanisms exist, whether they be, pulse surveys, macro surveys, leadership, mailboxes. Like, so we've got all those mechanisms in place, and the AI infrastructure is just tapping into sort of that listening.
Yep.
I like that point. It's like building the infrastructure for disruption. Whenever that does happen, you've got that in place. Brad, are you seeing any specific strategies on that issue itself, like getting getting feedback and getting back to people about these issues around AI tools and how AI is being implemented because it's changing how people are working so much. I'd love to hear what else you're seeing on specific strategies for listening about AI design or implementation.
Yeah, so internally, we've been doing a quarterly AI pulse for almost 2 years now,
Hmm.
getting regular feedback around usage, use cases, benefits, and we're leaning heavily into the qualitative feedback that people are providing. And so, a lot of listening has traditionally been more quantitative of, scales, numerical values. Um, but we're really trying to understand the lived experience. What's working well? What are the concerns? And those details are really difficult to suss out if you only have, a quantitative approach to it. One of the things that I think has been really important, and this is some additional context that we've added in the panel data that we gathered for state of employee listening. We also asked about organizational culture, which has not been something that we've asked about in state of employee listening, and then also AI maturity as well. And one of the things that we're finding is there is a strong association between listening maturity and AI maturity, which is not that surprising. But there's also a strong association between organizational culture and AI maturity. And the organizations that are more hierarchical, that have a higher power distance, they're more bureaucratic, those are far less likely to have seen progress so far based on AI. And we still see a lot of leaders in those organizations having these AI mandates of we need to use AI.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, I think there's a lot of fear in some of those cultures, and people don't feel comfortable either trying things, that are uncertain, so they pull back, or they may be using technology, but they're not willing to talk about it because then there's this fear of if I unveil this productivity hack, what is that going to mean for me? And am I undermining my own job security? And so I think there's some really important connections back to trust and leadership around demonstrating competence and change management, demonstrating care for people, and having colleagues trust that they're going to work alongside us during these implementations. And then also clearly communicating what are the goals, what are the objectives, what are the expectations. So it does kind of go back to some change management and trust and leadership basics, but they're critically important because we know the stakes are really high right now in terms of the organizations that do this well and how they're going to differentiate themselves from those that don't. But at the core, listening is a part of it. And one other quick point, Laura has talked quite a bit about scale, which is obviously critical in an organization like Hilton. What we're seeing in terms of AI is the ability to scale qualitative research methodologies
Right.
because for so long it was like, and I've worked with companies where they were like, well, we're not even going to ask open-ended comment questions because we can't possibly get through
What
them
do
all.
we do with it once we
What do
get
we
it?
do with it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Hmm.
overwhelming. And so, at the end of the day, we want to understand people's lived experiences. We want to understand what's going right. We want to understand, potential friction points and pain points for them at work. And this is where AI does a fantastic job. So we have a conversational listening agent that a lot of our clients are beginning to roll out where it actually talks to people. And based on their feedback, it digs deeper and it's trained on concepts like saturation and structured, interviewing and things that you would normally do in like a focus group setting. It does that so that we get better qualitative feedback rather than because sometimes you read comments and you're like, okay, but what do you really mean? Or what are you trying to say with this? And it's unfortunate, but now AI is giving us the ability to basically have a conversation one-on-one at scale in any language in real time, and I think that also builds people's trust and confidence as they see it used in ethical and responsible ways.
As you see, Brad, I'm curious, as you see people use AI in those ways that you're describing to really get more out of the data and the insights that they're gathering, what's the biggest mistake that you see organizations keep making, even though they should know this? So, particularly when it comes to AI, are there some big mistakes that you see repeated more often?
Yeah, so I would say the one mistake would be treating data like a report card more than a
Hmm.
diagnostic,
Yep.
and just kind of looking at it from there. With AI specifically, I think there are some real concerns. I had a colleague recently during an executive presentation, one of the executives shared that they took all of the comments, downloaded the comments, put them into a GPT, and the prompt was something along the lines of, our engagement score is 80%. Is that surprising to you given these comments? Now, the comments were specific to asking people, it was either what's your greatest source of frustration or asking for recommendations for improvement, but it was designed, the question was designed to get constructive criticism. And based on that prompt, it created uncertainty or undermined that leader's trust and confidence in the data, but it was really an issue with the specific prompt. So I think, at this point, if people are using general, openly available AI tools and trying to engage, I think it's really important to understand the potential risk factors that it's user error really is what it comes down to. And also concern around, I've seen organizations admit to some things that I'm like, we have much tighter security and data privacy standards, and so in some cases they're kind of likely violating their own corporate policies in what they're doing, and also creating the opportunity for hallucinations. And sometimes, they may be getting feedback that sounds highly plausible, but it's not accurate to what the data is that they're putting into the tool, because the tool is not purpose designed and built, and may not have the same guardrails that they may assume are in place. So I think that's an AI specific
Yeah.
risk that I've seen some organizations fall into.
Laura, are there ways you're guarding against some of those things that he just described?
Yeah, look, I mean, for us, I was just listening to Brad. I think the storytelling around the data is so important, and we've put so much emphasis on our people analytics team to not just doing the data dump. I mean, there is an avalanche of data even before AI, right?
Mhm.
Like that our leaders receive around the business, around all the performance metrics, the guest experience, that we can't come in here with HR with like, here's our 50-page survey report. So like, what are the insights? What are the stories? How do we go back and tell our team members? Again, it's hard to scale nuance when you're operating at 100 plus countries. So what are the simple repetitive messages, the core takeaways, the core actions? So for us, like that emphasis on the qualitative, the insights, the storytelling, and being able to really achieve that consistently, so that all of our team members then become those evangelists of the actions that we've taken. And AI, I think, can help, but it can also truly create the opposite, right? Where, I mean, we've all heard of brains, work slop, brain fry, and all the, the flip side of the coin when not managed properly. So
Yep.
we're over investing and leveraging AI to really help us tell better stories and drive to like the two most important things, the three most important things. I don't want this to become a widening of the aperture, but a more precise diagnostic and a more engaging, model for our leaders and our team members.
I like that phrase, a more precise diagnostic, because there's going to be so much that comes out of this. There's a question in the chat, Laura, that I thought I'd put to you, which is, what are the most effective questions you put to employees in order to get key insights specifically about engagement levels? With a 93% engagement rate, are there some specific questions that have been particularly effective when it comes to really measuring and knowing more about that?
Yeah, our global engagement survey does have 50 questions. So each year we're like, okay, do we narrow this down? Like, what pulse surveys look different, and we're about to embark on the journey of like, what does it need to look like this year? We obviously like consistency, to be able to have trend lines. The questions I most like are the ones that really do achieve the, what is the pain point that is getting in the way of you doing your best job, right? So, tell me one thing that we are doing that's making it hard for you to excel. So those sort of range of questions that really get to the constructive criticism. And then I like the questions that open up sort of the big sky thinking, right? And so truly hey, if you had a magic wand, what is the one thing you'd like to do to make our guest experience better? What is, the thing you're most passionate about that we're delivering for our guests? So those categories of questions I find are really impactful for us. We have all the standard things that you would expect that are really important, because as we diagnose every step of the talent lifecycle, we want to make sure that we're going into, management, leadership, benefits. All those things are important, and they have driven some of the most meaningful, scalable programs that we have launched, and allow us also to identify the more nuanced gaps. Is this a mentorship gap, a sponsorship gap, a job opening gap when you think of career trajectory? But I like to really understand leveling up on a cultural level, like as a company, what are we getting wrong? How does it connect to our guest experience? And what are we not doing? What's the opportunity we're leaving on the table? And those sometimes really allow our team members in this moment also to feel like they have agency into our business, right? We're not just asking you about, your little HR enrollment to your benefits. That's important. We want to get that right. But this is a moment where we get to shape like who we are as a company. And those I feel have been really powerful stories to tell our team members too. And by the way, I will say, of course, we're in the context of scalability and surveys, but I ask those questions when I meet with people one-on-one. I'll ask them what's the coolest thing you're working on right now? And the twinkle in their eye, suddenly, or if you had a magic wand, one of my leaders always ask, if you had a magic wand, you could remove one problem, what would it be? Or you could make one thing happen in this company. So I borrow that from her. And it suddenly, the conversation is very different, right? About, possibility and dreaming big. And that's, those are the principles we were founded on. And when I think about listening too, I'll give you an example of the micro listening example. A couple of years I was traveling with our CEO. We were in Portugal. We had a big town hall with, a hotel, large hotel. And one team member asked to speak to me at the end of this town hall. And so, we're coming off the stage, a big rush, and he comes up to me. I'd never met him. He's like, yeah, I've heard you in different settings, and I want you to know my story, which was, very tragic loss that he had experienced of a child studying abroad, had passed away, horrific, right? So he's telling me the story. We're both getting emotional. I'm asking him, show me some pictures of your family. And he's telling me listen, in this moment, and I've been a longstanding Hilton team member, my Hilton team supported me in extraordinary ways, but also fell short in a few things that I think you could fix. And I was like, tell me more. And in that conversation, he gave me some feedback and some ideas. I flew back, to the States and thought about this, connected with my benefits team. I'm we need to solve this at scale. Even if it's only for 10 people in this tragic circumstance, how can we take this moment of listening, of sharing the most vulnerable of feedback, and transform it? And through that one conversation, we launched what is now a global crisis concierge that this team member, who is not in HR, helped us architect, scale, launch, and has now helped, not thousands, because I hope we don't have thousands of team members in these horrific moments, but hundreds of team members when it mattered most. And so that to me is a moment of sharing and listening, actioning, scaling, and telling a story. That didn't happen through a survey. I don't know if he would have ever put something like that.
Right. Would he have put it in a survey? And I love that you also just showed us the value of storytelling and how you're able to tell those stories after they're, after you get that information. Brad, and just what a great story of how you put into place what you're hearing as a leader when you're having these conversations. Brad, there's a question in the chat that I also think is really relevant because, Laura just described a very human-centric, story, one where someone was in a crisis, and Hilton is a company where there's a lot of very human stories where, there's this huge front line for organizations that may not be quite as people focused, that don't have as big of a workforce, that, there's not as much of that interaction, that customer experience, that employee experience. Do you find that organizations say it's harder to build and deliver an authentic listening cycle? Are there different ways they should approach it? And any tips for organizations that might be a little less, filled with the kind of front line that Hilton has here?
Yeah, so I think there's two ways to look at it. One is from an academic research perspective and the kind of rigor, it's definitely can be a challenge. You may, even if you survey everybody in the organization, it's like you're trying to analyze the data. There are going to be limitations just because you don't have as many people. And so, no change may be deemed statistically significant. But I think at its core, when we realize that this is an opportunity to connect with and learn from our colleagues, that can happen in the biggest organizations in the world. It can also happen in the context of one-on-one relationships. And when leaders understand that this is really about giving people that sense of agency and influence and a sense of self-determination and how things are going to go, that can even happen in I'm coming up on my 16th wedding anniversary. It happens in one-on-one, and in a way it's like we're running a business. We've got 4 kids. My wife, we homeschool. Like it very much is a business in some ways. And I think one of the important pieces too, and this is kind of an analogy for listening and communication in general, if organizations put all of the weight in an annual census survey and this big listening event, and there's all this energy. Census surveys are not going away. I don't see that. I think organizations are adding to it. But that would be a little bit like me putting all of my relationship with my family on our one big vacation that we're going to take every year. And that may be great, and vacations are good. But the small individual interactions that we have throughout the year are so much more important
Yeah.
in terms of the health of our relationship in our home. And so the same is true in businesses, no matter how big or small they are. It's about listening, it's about responding, it's about adapting a growth mindset where we see potential and opportunity in others, and also personalize our interactions to, where are they today? What's the conversation that they need to have? What are their unique strengths or challenges that they're facing in the moment? So all of that, I think, when done well at scale, means incredible organizational culture and listening and great outcomes. But that scales all the way down to one-on-one, and it's about being, a good person and human being in the moment.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a way that they can, and if, I would never look, I think it's inspiring to hear what a company like Hilton is doing, but don't put yourself in a position where it's like, if we can't do that, then we're not going to
Yeah.
take the first step,
Right.
because everybody's got to start somewhere. And even if you're in a big organization, but you're responsible for a smaller segment, there's still an opportunity to influence and infuse culture through that human experience, whatever your sphere of influence may be.
We've
Well,
got
and I
just a
think it's so well said. Like the main point isn't to scale programs, but it's to the most powerful words a human can say to one another are, I'm listening. And,
yeah.
in a follow-up conversation, I've been reflecting on what you've said.
hmm
Tell me more. Like those are the ways in which you build connection. So for us, it's also those micro, the in the moment, the connective tissue between surveys, between pulses. It's the day-to-day experience. We all know that. People
Yeah.
don't leave companies, they leave their managers when they don't feel seen, they don't feel listened to. So I think it's a beautiful full circle moment to like creating the human experience at work. It starts one-on-one, right? Like
Yeah.
it has nothing to do with scale. We've had to do it at scale. So we're building those systems. But I keep going back to like this is about listening to each other like humans, which is what we need more of in the world. Jena, to your kickoff remarks.
Especially now, right? We have just a couple minutes left. Let me get each of you to give a very short 30-second close us out response to, if you're talking to an HR leader who, works for maybe a pretty complex organization, they feel like their program is stuck. They're running surveys, they don't know exactly what to do next, nothing's really changing. What's the number one thing you would tell them to do, tactic to take, change to make, to feel like they're jump starting things and getting some movement around these programs? 30 seconds or less.
Happy to
Brad,
go.
I'll have you start, Brad.
All right, you
Either way.
start, Brad.
Okay, so I would say, get really clear on what the organization is trying to accomplish.
Mhm.
Get crystal clear on what are the objectives, what are the priorities that leaders have, and adopt a small company mindset to say, if we were a startup, if we were a tenth the size of what we are, what would we do to solve that problem? And be crystal clear on that management dilemma, and then work backwards to ensure that you're gathering, analyzing, and reporting the data so that it does move the organization forward, even if that means shaking off some of the, bureaucracy and history and, things that have been done. Just get rid of that just because we've always done it that way. And I think in a resource constrained environment, it also gives people the opportunity to influence change and introduce change that maybe should have been done 5, 10, 15 years ago. But now is the next best time to do it.
And Laura, what advice would you give?
I would say have a tight say-do ratio and a tight listen-act ratio. So really tighten that ratio. Make sure you're not asking and doing nothing about it, and have a storytelling strategy. Like, how are you going to inspire people through the actions that you've taken in your listening strategy? So storytelling and a tight listen-act ratio.
Yeah, I really like that. Thank you both so much for being with us today. I feel like lots of great insights shared, lots of great ideas, lots of great stories shared, which I think is one of my big takeaways, is just the power of storytelling in helping to reinforce that the organization is listening and that they do hear you. And I appreciate both of you sharing all of those insights. A link to the chat is available. I mean, a link to the research is available in the chat. We're excited to dive deeper into it. And again, thank you, Laura. Thank you, Brad. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm looking forward to the next time we have a chance to talk. Thank
Excellent.
you.
Thank you so
Thank you
much,
so
Jenna.
much. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.